Okay, hi guys. Okay,
Hello.
Oh,
so I am pleased to now announce our next speakers, which is Chris and Claire Sands, and they come to us all the way from England, and they are the hosts of the Silent Y podcast. So with that, I'm just going to switch it over to you guys and let you guys do your thing.
Lovely, great. Thank you. I'm just going to try and share our screen because we have got some slides to share with you. Lovely. Hello, I'm Claire. Nice to be with you today.
yeah, and I'm Chris. Thank you so much for the invite to join you. It's a real honor to be part of this. Really touched by what Emily had to share. So thank you for that. And lovely as well to know that there were some themes already emerging through what Emily was saying to what we'll be sharing in this next sort of 45, 50 minutes, time for Q&A at the end. If you have any questions, be thinking of them while we're speaking. As Claire said, we'll be using slides. Hopefully you can see us in a tiny little thumbnail picture on your screen. If there's anything on the slides that you want to take pictures of, you're welcome to remember at later stages, and then please feel free. To introduce us, we host the Silent Y podcast. We've been doing that since 2021 as amateurs so far. We're on a specific mission, and that's to explore 101 different types of loss, permanent loss, not just bereavements, and to hear from those who, of course, have experienced them. Through the podcast, we want to discover. Click on the
I said
screen.
it. Okay, sorry.
There
There we
go.
go.
There's the question. Can hope be found in every type of loss?
Yeah, we love having deep conversations with people. We always have. So we're going to share with you what we've learned from having those on the podcast about grief and hope. And we're going to leave space at the end for a Q&A. So we're very open about anything. If you want to ask us about anything or our guests about us, feel free to do that. So yeah, jot them down if you think of them during the session. We're happy for you to contact us afterwards as well. So we can put details in the chat of our email and website. Feel free to ask us anything. So the outline for this session is going to be across 5 main areas. Who, why, what, how, hope. There isn't really a short version for this, but we gave it a go. Not really the snappy thing we were after, but that's kind of how we're going to lay it out. So we're going to look at who we are, why are we doing what we do, what is grief, how do we cope with it, and hope, how to find it. So we'll start with the who. Like Chris said, we're podcast hosts. We're a married couple. We've been married 20 years this month. I know we don't look old enough. We're childless after infertility, and we live in Gloucestershire in England, which is near the Cotswolds, if you've heard of it. What we're not grief specialists. We're not psychiatrists. We're not psychologists. We're not qualified people in grief. We don't know all the models for getting through it or the specific stages you face or the scientific reasons for why you might grieve and how.
You might be asking at this point, why on earth are we here on this virtual stage? Well, we are a husband and wife who've experienced loss in different forms. That might be money, might be health, identity, family members, friends, the children of friends. The biggest one of those that led us to this podcast journey and through the journey so far is infertility on my side, which has led into childlessness for us both.
And we have interviewed nearly 100 people about over 60 different types of loss. And our guests have shared everything with us, from the raw initial stages of grief right through to the hope they might have found after it. So to kick us off and remind us what grief feels like and how we're not alone in feeling those really raw feelings, we thought we'd share some audio of our guests talking about what their grief felt like from a whole host of different losses.
We hope to share some audio of our guests. There's a lot of screen time in life now. If you want to rest your eyes while this is playing, we'll give it a try. There might be a little delay. About 2 minutes of audio. Feel free to rest your eyes. You have our blessing to do that. We'll play this audio, see if it works, and maybe Camille or someone will tell us if you can't hear anything.
Yeah, can anyone hear it? It's not coming out of our screen.
We're not able to hear it.
Bear with us.
Yeah. When I said amateur podcasts, it has no bearing on our technical ability, we can assure you. Delighted as well in the introduction, just while Claire's sharing that we were introduced as Chris and Claire Sands, because it looks like Sandy's in the spelling. It's got a Y in there. And one of the sort of the hidden meanings of the podcast name, which is the Silent Y, has a bearing on our surname, because for years, when people ask about my surname, I say Sands with a silent Y. So the little sort of hidden Easter egg there, if you know what that is in terms of the naming of the podcast.
Right, okay. So, thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, so I sent the link to you, Rachel. So see if you can work out. You'll see the slideshow with the audio on. It's got a little audio icon at the bottom corner, which you can probably see now. And if you click on that, it plays. But this was basically a compilation of all of our podcast guests, well, not all of them, but a few of our podcast guests, just talking about those raw moments of grief, just how hard it is, how long they cried for, what that looked like for them, how it felt inside, just to sort of help us know that we're not alone in feeling those feelings, and no matter how hard they can be. And it finished off with you had someone reach out to them just saying, it's okay, we're here, we're going to help you. And that's kind of what we're here for as well. We'd like to think that we're here to help people know there's a path through grief and that you don't have to walk it on your own.
Should we just carry on?
Yeah, we'll carry on.
Yeah, okay. So why are we doing what we do? Why did we decide to launch a global podcast? That sounds grand, doesn't it, about grief? Well, Claire and I, we've always enjoyed deep conversations, quite unusual. Some might think we enjoy deep conversations. We enjoy talking about big topics, and we've always appreciated discussing questions that people often keep to themselves in private, those silent why questions. For us, facing childlessness involves a grief that no one prepared us for. It has been confusing. How do you grieve something you never actually had in the first place? It feels different to the bereavements we've faced. And we came to the realization that if we're going through a loss that people don't really understand, clearly there must be thousands of others going through types of loss that are just as hard, just as confusing to navigate.
So we thought, let's find these people, let's chat to them, let's see what their experience has been, but not just chat to them about the sadness of grief. Let's see if it's possible to find hope in every kind of permanent loss.
We became fascinated by that question. Can hope be found in every kind of grief and loss? And so we've got a couple of main aims with the Silent Why podcast and everything else that comes with it to help people feel less alone in their loss. You heard that from Emily. You're not alone. We want people to know they're not alone in their loss and to share the good news that it's possible to find hope again.
I don't know if you've ever been in a really dark place. You probably have if you're part of this session. And there's that point when you just can't see the way forward. It's painful, it's confusing, it's lonely. And then maybe you've come across somebody or you've heard somebody speaking and they've just had those magical words where they say, I know what to do, or I can help you, or there is hope. I've had it myself. And those words aren't nothing. In moments like that, when you're so desperate for guidance, they mean so much, especially when you can't see hope for yourself.
Yeah, so that's our mission. Discover if it's possible to find hope in every kind of loss. We do it to show others as well they're not alone in their loss, in their grief, and hopefully to model as well, which is quite important, to model deep, caring, inspiring conversation. And maybe that's something you don't know or you don't feel you have very much with your family, with your friends, but we love to try and model to those that it isn't natural to what deep, caring, inspiring conversation looks like. We've found they're very important parts of working with grief. So far on our journey to explore 101 different permanent losses, we've reached 62. And Claire's going to tell you about some of them.
Yeah, so I've put some of them on the screen. This is not all of them. There's lots of different types of loss. I've just put them roughly into 4 categories. You've got your bereavements, loss of relatives, siblings, parents, children, grandparents. And we did a whole series on loss of pregnancies, babies and children, from everything from sudden infant death syndrome to shaken baby syndrome, cancer, natural disasters, school shootings. And then there's other situations where we might lose people that are a little bit more complicated to grieve, maybe. Grieving a suicide, grieving with mental illness involved, or maybe the loss of someone that you didn't actually know if you loved at all. That can be really difficult. What if it's a bad or a complex death, or death through something like autoerotic asphyxiation, a very adult subject that can be very hard to talk about for some people. And then we had loss of a queen in this country as well. But also physical losses. There's loss of arms, tooth, skin, hair. Loss through dementia, fertility, which was R1, facial scarring, or the loss of ability after a stroke. There's some examples of those. Then we looked at people who worked in loss. Every day their job involved loss, whether that was the loss of a species through extinction. We spoke to somebody about that. What does that feel like when we're constantly losing people that way? Losing species that way. Loss as a pediatric nurse, if you're working in intensive care, when you see a lot of life and death. Or what about around murder, or a funeral director, or a cardiac surgeon when they lose patients on the table sometimes? What does that feel like? How do they cope with that? Then there's other losses, lots of others. Loss of a marriage, loss of dreams, loss of parenting a sick or disabled child, loss of veterans, loss of childhood, loss of photos or possessions, loss of your reality, loss through addictions, the loss that can attach itself to happy life transitions. That can be quite interesting as well. And then other types of loss like disenfranchised grief, sexual grief, and cumulative grief. So that's just a snapshot of the losses we've looked at. Some people will suffer a few of those in amongst one loss. But we wanted to do more than just speak to people who have been through grief. And we learned quite quickly that actually you can prepare yourself for grief to a certain extent. So we introduced some Let's Chat episodes where I chat to someone who works in an area that is experienced or trained in a type of loss. And we look at those as to how we can prepare ourselves for loss going forwards. Some of those subjects, again, not all of them, facing our mortality, coping with PTSD, how to be more self-aware, chatting to people, again, who work in these kinds of areas, what happens in the brain when we're grieving, how can we use personality tools to help us understand how we grieve, handling loss in the workplace, National Child Abuse Prevention Month, which we just had recently, what life is like in a hospice, the pain of kids going back to school if you haven't got a child or if your child's future is looking different from what you expected. And then how we can use things like running or writing or even colour in our grief. And then the last one was a bereavement expert I spoke to about how you can see grief as an adventure, which is a very interesting topic. As one of those guests said to me recently, we prepare for the small things in life, like headaches. We have coping mechanisms, we have medication to hand, we know what to do generally with those things, but we don't prepare for the big moments in life like grief. So these episodes are to help us for those moments ahead.
In our short time with you this morning, we want to bring the experience of our 218 episodes through the podcast and share some of the main things that we've learned personally and, of course, through our guests about navigating and coping with grief. And why the fact that grief is so unique makes it easier and also harder to cope with.
Sorry, I've just seen that Rachel was asking me for permissions for this link I sent her. Sorry, Rachel, I'll get onto that. But we also want to add a small caveat here at the start before we do any of this, because a lot of what we're going to share doesn't have to apply to those very early stages of grief. So you'll know the moments I mean, the hours, days and weeks when all you can do is focus on surviving. When it's about getting through the day, remembering to breathe, trying to eat or stop eating, depending on how you're dealing with it, and just get through everything one day at a time. There's not a lot that can be done to help you in that stage. It needs to be endured, it needs to be expressed, it needs to be felt. And hopefully you can do that in a safe space with support around you. But sadly, we know that's not everyone's experience. But what we're going to be talking about is a bit more relevant for the time when the shock and the trauma subsides a little, when you feel that need to start to move forward again in some way, but you're not really sure how, or life seems to be moving forwards, but you feel a bit stuck.
There's no timeline on any of this. Grief and its initial stages are different for everyone. I'd love to sit here now and give you a 3-step plan to heal all your grief and get through this. As a title, that would be far more attractive to what we're doing, but it's not the reality of grief. You'll know that, and that's why it's so hard, it's so scary, it's so confusing. Again and again, we hear our podcast guests agreeing that no one teaches you how to deal with this stuff, whether it's the sudden death of someone, whether it's a change in a person or the loss of a relationship or any other kind of loss. That's partly the problem. No one can tell you how to do it because every grief is as different as the person going through it.
And let's face it, we don't like being out of control. And grief, well, it takes control. But seeing how other people have coped with it, we believe really helps us find out how we can get through it, which is why we do what we do and why we want to share all this with you today. So what is grief?
I can tell you what it's not. Easy.
It's not easy. We all know that. A basic definition by the American Psychological Association is that grief is the anguish experienced after significant loss.
But we know it doesn't even have to be a significant loss. It can be any loss. And in an even simpler definition that everyone agrees with, grief is pain. It's painful, so painful that at the time of experience it, you probably don't give two hoots what the definition is. We know we don't need to define it for you. Maybe you felt it. Everyone has or will at some point, because grief is ultimately part of being human. No one escapes it. It can't be avoided. Grief is not something to endure for a short while, like an illness. It's something that changes the fundamental core of us. It changes our story, it changes our words, it changes how we view life forever. It's part of every human journey.
Yeah, and some people seem to face more than that than others, but that's another part of human life. It's not fair. Some people are born into poverty, some people are born into abusive families, some into war zones, some are abandoned at birth, some live days, some live over 100 years. Some people have too many children to cope with, some can't have any. The human experience isn't fair, and that's a really bitter pill to swallow sometimes, but actually it can be quite liberating once we come to terms with that. Grief is a very natural part of being human. It's the cost of loving or treasuring something, and it's not something to try and avoid because you can't. If you try and avoid it, or you don't or can't express grief early on when you face it, the chances are, instead, you'll find those raw, painful moments will break out 2 years later when something randomly triggers you in the supermarket.
Grief will always find a way out. It will always be part of our lives, just as loss is a big part of life in this world. Death is as natural as being born. You don't have one without the other, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it, to use the word death. So much of grief is frightening to people because it's not talked about.
Not talking about death or grief doesn't change the fact that around 150,000 adults and children will die today across the world. None of us have been promised tomorrow. And ignoring this doesn't stop it happening, but it does isolate those going through it and stops us preparing people for loss. None of us know what shape grief is going to come to us in, but it will come. And this can be equally as comforting as it is scary. Because how it comes is often what scares us the most. It makes it difficult to bear and very hard to understand. We all have losses that we think we're prepared for, or we think we could cope with. And we all have losses that we never want to go through. But sadly, we don't get to choose. So either we have to find a way to live with grief and accept it as part of life, or spend our life fighting it as it slowly destroys the things around you and inside you. It's really hard. It's not easy. Grief gets everywhere when it arrives. It attaches itself to every part of life, and that can be really hard to accept and understand. I found this poem a little while ago by Gwen Flowers that really helped me in this aspect. It's called Grief. I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was the sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, acceptance. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. Grief is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, a new way of seeing, a new dimension of self. It's an absorption. Grief becomes part of you, and it changes you forever, whether we want it to or not. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. We can never go back to who we were before grief. As you move forwards, it will always be with you in some form or other. But you can choose to allow what grief is in your life.
Another weird thing about grief, considering all the pain it can bring, is that sometimes we actually need to be told, you're grieving. It's rarely obvious to us, especially if it's not a bereavement we're processing, because the world isn't great at recognizing grieving unless human death is involved. We had to work this out for ourselves with childlessness. We've also seen people go through it with things like retirement too. A couple of examples: if you're caring for a child who's lived through being shaken or experiencing a head trauma, there's no bereavement there, so the world around you might not understand there are still things to grieve, which might be just as traumatic as a death for you. We've learned that just because someone or something survives, or there isn't a loss of life, doesn't mean there isn't grief attached. Another example might be a divorce. The world around you says, well, no one died, so why should someone be grieving? But there's still a loss, a death of sorts, of a dream, clearly of a relationship. Maybe that was your identity, the future you were expecting. One of our podcast guests told us that she believed it would have felt easier if her husband had died than to experience him choosing to leave her and be with someone else.
Then there's the fact that sometimes you find yourself facing more than one loss at the same time. To use an example we've been through, we realised we were going to be childless, and you might think the loss is not having children, which it was. But what we didn't realise was it came with loss of identity, never being a mother or father, loss of dreams, loss of a future that you imagined, the ongoing loss of not experiencing all the milestones that come with being a parent, the loss of being a grandparent, or providing cousins, uncles and aunts, the rest of your family, the grief of not fitting in with friends who go on to be parents. So often our grief is actually a complicated mix of more than one loss. And it's good to recognise those and give them their own spaces to be grieved.
And through the Silent Why podcast, we've found a valuable part of navigating this is to find groups, to find people that have experienced the same or similar losses to yourself. Like here today with us virtually. You're here online with others who have similar experiences, similar feelings. Only other people that have experienced the death of a child to shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma, or a child who has lasting disabilities as a result, will fully understand and feel what the associated losses might be like. And yes, there will be nuances that are different within that type of loss. No loss is ever the same. Even siblings mourning the death of the same parent will do it very differently, or parents of the same child. But knowing you're not alone in what you're going through is a really valuable tool for healing.
Let's take the example of a child being shaken and look at the losses that might be involved, and this won't be all of them. So there's loss of life if there's a death. There might be loss of abilities, physical, mental, emotional. Loss of identity for the child, for those caring, or for those that did the shaking. Loss of trust in the child's carer, in yourself, as Emily was talking about, or wider trust in general. Loss of faith. Where was God in this? Loss of a future, the child getting married, having their own children, etc. The loss of a chance of education or a certain path that you'd envisaged for that child. Loss of freedom if there's a conviction involved. Loss or change in relationships around you. Disenfranchised loss. If a child survives, there might be the pressure to feel grateful. Also, the loss will be different depending on whether you're the parent, the grandparent, the uncle, the aunt, the carer, the adoptive or foster parent, the guardian or the sibling, etc.
And as we learned in 2 episodes featuring shaken baby syndrome, preventable losses can add a whole host of other unwanted emotions to process as well. So yeah, grief is really complicated. It's a complicated thing to journey through. And to come back to the earlier point, we found that knowing you're not alone in it, that you're not the only one feeling the way you are, is a very, very powerful place to start. We can safely say you're not alone in what you're feeling right now. That's a small fraction with the people here online, part of this symposium, of people who are impacted by similar losses across the world.
So how? How do we cope with grief? This would be another time that I would love to give you a slide with 3 points on it that tell you exactly how to get through grief. And I am so sorry that it is not that easy. But that's largely because it's so personal and unique to us. So there isn't one right way to grieve, and therefore there isn't one right way to cope with it. Sometimes coping will look like sobbing on the floor in a snotty mess, allowing yourself to feel all the feelings. Sometimes it's pulling yourself together, putting on your big girl pants, even you men, and attending a friend's birthday party. It varies from person to person, but on the whole, coping with grief after these initial stages has started to ease. Is largely finding your own way to allow yourself to feel the feelings inside you, which can be really frightening and scary, but not second guessing them or trying to feel things that aren't there or ignoring what is there. And then eventually being able to start to re-engage with the world again.
We'll just pause for a moment. We're going to be hopefully hearing from some of our podcast guests. So while Claire checks her emails, and we maybe send a message out to our hosts to see if there's been any breakthrough with making audio work. I don't know the slide number in particular, if that's helpful to know, but it's the second one that features the little sort of phone icon that's got embedded audio in it.
I'm not sure we've had any joy.
Sounds good. I've got it downloaded, so I'm going to try to share it, and we're going to see if this works.
Okay, great. We've got a slide to put up with it,
yeah,
so I'll do that. But yeah, go on.
Through the podcast and through the last 4 years that we've spent sort of meeting people in their experience of grief and loss, we've become firm believers that learning about how other people have dealt with their grief is a great starting point to help us find our own ways. Maybe when you meet others that have gone through similar experiences to you, have you thought about asking the question, how did you deal with grief? How did you process it? And we've got 3 clips from 3 different guests that we're going to hear that Claire's edited together. We guarantee you won't have heard all of these ideas for coping with grief before. Hopefully you will hear them if the sound works. On the screen, hopefully we'll put the names of the guests on and what their exact losses were. It's about 7 minutes long, so if you want to give your eyes a rest, feel free. But we'll try and play the audio now and then put the text on the screen to accompany it. Thank you, Camille.
Absolutely. Here's to hoping it works.
We did struggle with the question of how are we going to do this? And then when we made it through his life and we got through his death, It took about 8 or 9 months before, I can't even say anger, it was rage, before rage came, because we had planned so much. We had prepared so much. I mean, being told that your child is going to die is really unthinkable news, something you don't ever want to have to imagine, but we had to imagine it because it was going to be our reality. So I compensated for that by over imagining it. I planned so much that I had normalized it. I managed my grief so much that I squished it down until it couldn't stay in there anymore. And the fracturing began when I had such ugly, horrible thoughts. I mean, my husband came home from work and a coworker had a baby that had some touch and go issues. And she sent him a very kind text saying, I wanted to let you know, little boy's doing fine. Thank you so much. It must have been your prayers that saved our baby. And I was a crazy person. I mean, I began throwing things and screaming because if prayers were going to save a baby, don't you think they would have saved our baby? It cracked me open and the rage just poured out of me. And it was scary. It was a really scary, probably about 6 to 8 weeks of a kind of madness that I had never experienced before that needed a physical outlet. I formed the smash pile. So we gathered anything breakable in the house that I was willing to destroy. And we kept piles of these things by the back door. And when the rage came, I would open the door and I would grab things, and we have a concrete walkout from our basement. So I can stand at ground level and hurl glass objects into this concrete stairwell in a very safe way. Such an outlet for me. I will confess, I got the idea from the smash pile of trying to smash things in the house, and that did not go well. And I also started with things that were not satisfying. Like I grabbed a big box of heavy pancake mix and threw it down to the ground, in a rage. And it was good. It was not what I was looking for. So the first time I took something outside and I hurled it down and it just shattered. And I thought, yes, that is exactly how I feel.
I do it in my car. That's where I release those emotions. My car has become a place where I cry heavily, or I just curl up and let those emotions out. Very difficult for me to do that in the house or in front of the children. And there's just so much that sits inside of you because it's constant. It really never ends. And so I think that's a place where every single day I go out, I take an hour or two for myself, and that's where the tears really flow out, or where I do some of my writing, where I just let those heavy emotions out. I remember early on in the process, my social worker said, just go to the park and start throwing stones in the river. And if you can't scream, just throw them, with anger, or just throw them as far and as hard as you can. And so I started doing that, and that has helped me. For me, it's been through the creative process. I started doing art. I started creating things. I found that if I take, scissors and paper and start cutting and gluing, and I started creating pieces that I just never thought that was in me. I was like, what? Suddenly I had time that just took my mind to a different realm. I was not a mom to a child with cancer. I was just me cutting figures and gluing them and creating something. And so that has become a real passion of mine. I really found that I needed something to put energy into that was not related to this disease, to this reality. That's something I started to do. I still do it, but that has saved me, definitely.
I think I was so shocked that took precedence for months. And there was an insistence to sell our family house very, very, very quickly. So it was just like my entire life was just ripped apart. That's the only way I can explain it, really. What I did was I bought a house very quickly, just to shove all my stuff in. And I had a lovely cat called Dewey, and she was my companion and my mate. And I lay in bed with her one day and I went, Dewey, what are we going to do now? And it just went boom, I'm going to go and buy a narrowboat. So that's what I did. I went and bought a narrowboat, and I went off traveling the canals for 3.5 years. And the narrowboat was just like my cradle, my crying cradle. And I just spent hours tied up along the towpath, wailing. Did I cry? And it's really hard physical work being a solo boater when you're traveling. I got so fit physically, and that kind of sustained this complete falling apart. But I was crying for my life, really, and all the stuff that hadn't worked out, and all the disappointments I'd had in my life. All I knew is I needed to fall apart to save myself and to find out who I really was. You know, I didn't want to be saved. I didn't want to be with other people. I really needed that time. You know, we're not good at crying in this country. You know, everybody says, oh, don't cry. And I thought, sod it, I'm not going to cry. I'm going to scream. So I did. And it went on for about 3 years, you know, not every day like it was immediately. In between, I was really, really doing my own work and dealing with what loss meant to me and grief. And I thought I knew it all. I thought, being a bereavement counsellor and a bereavement therapist, I knew what grief was. No, I did not. But I do now.
It's reassuring, isn't it, that even a bereavement counsellor doesn't know everything, that no one can tell you. They know everything that you've felt or experienced going through your own grief. And hallelujah for the audio. Thank you for the teamwork there. You know, look what happens when you can work together and talk and process this stuff. So what you heard there from just 3 clips of 3 different guests through the podcast, you heard talk of cutting and sticking. Love the one about smash piles, and also narrowboats, or you might call them houseboats in the States. As those voices show, coping with grief is as creative as we are individuals. And that's just 3 stories from over 60 that we've heard from.
And we can tell you that as part of their stories, wonderful things have actually emerged. So despite the anger that Elizabeth spoke of after her son died, she also told us about the most amazing 24 hours she had with her son just after he was born, where she told us of the immense joy that filled the delivery room. She has since birthed a book, as she says, about how to let yourself be loved. Diana is still parenting a child through cancer, but she's taken her artwork to a new level. She displays it in galleries, exhibitions, she runs workshops and classes, and it's really beautiful. I wanted you to see it because it's not your average cutting and sticking. And then Sue came through her divorce. She survived a light aircraft crash, and actually it fueled a real respect for mortality. So she's now passionate about spreading the message that we should embrace our mortality and not be afraid of it. And she did a TED talk called Wearing Your Mortality with Pride.
We're finding out through the podcast there are so many ways to cope with, to deal with grief and loss. But what is perhaps easier to spot, certainly for those on the outside looking in, is when we're not coping with grief. Again, we've heard how this can take many different forms. We're all so unique. Maybe there are certain things we can look for in this area. I wonder whether this might be a good time just to try and revisit the first bit of audio we were going to play, which we've since emailed to Rachel and Camille. So if it works for you guys, can you share the clip? I think it's titled Sad Clips. See if that one plays. That's just it's just 2 minutes, it's a short one.
Yeah, let me pull that one up.
I look back and I don't know how I survived. My body physically felt as though it was dying.
I'd become so debilitated with anxiety, overwhelm, panic. It was impacting every part of me.
I didn't feel like it was happening to me. I felt like I was observing it happen to someone else.
I was an absolute mess. I'd never cried so much in my life.
The midwife came in and looked at me and said, we can't find her heartbeat.
None of my peers had any experience of a parent with dementia. And so I felt very lonely in that.
My childlessness broke me open, perhaps even more so than my divorce. It brought me to my knees.
I honestly thought I can't do it. But then you do. You have no choice. You have a child who needs care.
There were around about 5 years of me feeling the loss of that, maybe even every day.
I remember spending my 40th birthday in prison and not getting a birthday card from my dad, and that breaking my heart.
Some people's scars are hidden, and mine is there for everybody to see, and I didn't like that.
I literally was so beaten down that I felt like the only place I belonged was with the dead.
Grief hits you that way, just sort of takes you out of where you are, takes everything away.
I'm grieving on a daily basis, and whenever he hugs me, it is so painful.
I put down the mirror and looked at myself and just burst out into tears.
I'd already handed my military ID card in and I cried my eyes out because I wasn't a soldier anymore.
I cried every day for 3.5 years because I felt like if I ever stopped crying, I was somehow dishonoring her memory.
Yesterday, I was ready to die, and today I'm still here, but I need help. I need help. And then they just started to tell me, okay, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say, and that's why we're here. But they're the clips of people just from the very early stages of all the interviews we've done with people. We do like to talk about the real raw moments of grief to start with, not just the hope, because they're the bits that people really connect with. It's hard to connect with the hope bit if you're not there yet. And we understand that because that can take years. So that's just an idea of where people have been in that early grief. And hopefully listening to that, it just helps you to know that you're not alone. There's some very honest, very raw, very painful experiences people have gone through. But sometimes hearing those can help you identify with how you've been and just make you feel like you're less alone in the process.
Each of those will have their own story of what it felt like, what it looked like to not cope with the grief that they are experiencing. And let's look at just a slide, some ways potentially of not coping. We'll just put the next slide up. Okay, so some of these maybe you can sort of resonate with you, maybe not, but an inability to function, maybe that's mentally, physically, emotionally, or spiritually. Maybe you've felt that. Or maybe functioning a bit too much, distracting yourself, keeping yourself super busy, filling your time. There are physical stress symptoms that the body, mind may feel, and health issues like IBS or skin conditions, headaches and migraines, clearly a very common one, as well as things like high blood pressure. Maybe breakdowns in relationships or withdrawing from relationships with friends, family, linked to isolating yourself. It's easier, isn't it, to feel like you just want to shut yourself away, keep the world out and isolate yourself. Is that a sign of potentially not coping with the grief that you're experiencing? Pushing others away and pushing the offers of help away, being consumed by that loss, just really unable to see anything beyond it right now. Another common one, mood changes. 1 minute irritable, anxious, frustrated, angry. The next minute lost, confused, whatever it may be. Mood changes are quite common. Having no capacity for others, as well as a lack of self-care. It might be to do with sleep, it might be to do with personal hygiene, just not looking after yourself. It's not a priority right now. Or compulsive behaviors such as overeating, spending, comforting yourself through binging or addiction. Some just, bits of evidence of what it looks like for some to not cope with what they're experiencing. It's no surprise, is it, that these occur, because loss brings with it a lot of stressful, unwanted, unwelcome, complex emotions and situations, feelings of anger, of rage, of confusion, a broken heart, having endless questions, maybe being completely numb, having to let go of things. Forgiveness can be really hard, certainly with what we're talking about today. Guilt, regret, and if you're dealing with a preventable loss, further questions, further emotions.
So they're kind of some of the warning signs. Maybe if you're not coping with grief, those things can all be part of grief, but if they're becoming elongated and they're becoming a bigger part of your life, it might be a sign that you're not really coping with it. So how do we cope with it? Well, we've learned through the podcast that because people are unique and grief is unique, so are the ways of coping with it. The things people do or don't do are often very creative, very personal. We're all different. There is no right or wrong way to do this. So as long as you try to do it in a way that doesn't further damage yourself or other people, then that's probably the right way for you. However, first and foremost, we would encourage you to at least find a way to express your grief, to feel it or talk about it somewhere. Allowing those feelings room to breathe is so important if you want to move forwards.
And while you're listening, to get your mind going for how you might do this, think about if any of these might apply to you. Just a few things to consider. Setting yourself goals, just like getting out of bed, tick. Eating regularly, tick. Going to work, sleeping well.
And talking about it, like I said, so important. Maybe with friends and family, but maybe through therapy or counselling, maybe in a grief support group, maybe online if that's what does it for you. Just something where you can start to express those feelings to other people who are sensitive and safe and will help you and listen.
Maybe you can get creative. You don't need to be a professional artist for this. Maybe you like art, writing, singing, acting, all ways that these things can be an outlet. Whether you're good at them or not, they can be an outlet for your grief. Creativity can be a really helpful way for the brain to process grief.
Maybe try something physical. One of our podcast guests processed the loss of his wife's pregnancy through running. And that can be especially helpful doing something physical if you're dealing with emotions like anger or anxiety.
Try something different, like something fun, like a smash pile. We've already heard that in one of the clips. Maybe decorating or refreshing things at home, new starts, new hobbies, learning a new skill. Engage your brain perhaps in a way that feels like you're achieving something while also hopefully enjoying it.
There might be something for you to try would be to set times and places to let your grief out. Diana talked about crying in her car because she couldn't do it at home with her family. Some people schedule grief. If you have a busy life, this can be a great way to not carry all your emotions into other situations like work. And if you've seen Shrinking on Apple TV, there's a coping mechanism for the grief of just playing a sad song once or twice a day and just letting the tears flow. And then when it finishes, they just get on and get up with the day. So there's different ways of doing it, but you might need to schedule it.
As Emily mentioned in the previous session, along similar lines, many people choose to help others, starting up organizations, charities, maybe campaigns, support groups, because sometimes helping others in their grief allows you to also access and process yours.
For me personally, it's been creative writing, journaling, and the blog that I write for the podcast. Even though Chris and I do talk a lot about what we're going through, I've processed a lot of my own grief through writing. Sometimes writing about personal experiences, sometimes through fictional characters. Sometimes it's just because I find the feelings and kind of making sense of them flow more naturally through a pen than me talking about them.
And for me, it's been recognizing when I'm feeling a bit griefy. That was a little phrase that came from one of our podcast guests who talks about griefy people. Sometimes I feel a bit griefy and trying to speak it out. That's really important. Actually putting words to it and speaking it out with Claire or with trusted friends or with family. It wasn't something I did very much, not intentionally, didn't bottle it up. But at one point, Claire said, do I ever find situations hard around other parents? And of course I did, lots, but I just didn't verbalize it. And that was a surprise to Claire. So now I try and do that more for my own benefit, to recognize as well that I don't have to be okay all the time or to put on a front.
Coping with grief can be really hard. We almost live in two worlds, the real world and the world of our loss. And when I spoke to bereavement expert Bianca in Let's Chat that I did last month, she explained why it's so hard after a bereavement when we start to feel love and joy again. She said when we grieve, we move from the world of the living into the world of the dead and back again, which is part of the dual process model, apparently. So when we laugh again, we feel bad because that's moving back into the world of the living where people laugh. And this is a vital bit that she said, living people must experience life. And over time, the oscillation between the living and the dead, it becomes more fluid and less intense. But this can be the case for losses that aren't bereavements too. And it's in these moments when we allow joy, laughter, and love back into our life that we start to see there can be good moments in grief. And that's when we start to glimpse how maybe grief could transpire into something more meaningful in our life.
I mean, clearly grief is something we can live without, right? We dislike it, maybe we dread it, we certainly want to avoid it. But we can testify to how it's actually the catalyst to many, many good things in this world. So often, charities and support groups, organizations, acts of kindness, some amazing human achievements, virtual family support symposiums, these are born out of places of loss. Many things, good things, can be found, can be felt, can be experienced, even while we're grieving.
Even if we're still holding grief in one hand, we can also hold joy, hope, freedom, acceptance, love, forgiveness, new life in the other hand. It's so important to know that you can hold grief and joy at the same time. One doesn't negate the other. This is one of the biggest lessons you can learn as you move forward with your grief and how you learn to cope with it. This is how people learn to cope with it, I think. Many beautiful things can be experienced and enjoyed while we're still carrying grief. And it's important to know that doesn't minimize or discount our loss in any way to engage with those, even though it feels a bit strange, or you might have some guilt, or you might find that really hard or painful or triggering, maybe even at the beginning. It's important to realize it doesn't minimize it, and engaging with those can become something really meaningful.
I'm just going to put back a slide for a comment from, might get the name spelt wrong, but Lucretia, saying go back to the previous slide. So we'll just put that out for a moment. Mashanta, thank you for your message as well. Just less than a month ago, having lost your mother-in-law. Really glad to know that so far today, some of what's been shared is resonating with you and supporting you. So thank you for those comments. And as was mentioned at the start of this, these sessions across today will be available on YouTube to watch back should you miss anything you want to catch up on again. Okay, let's move back to where we were. If we can learn how we can partner with our grief, it can mean that we can find a way to move forward while also incorporating it into our new life. Our very first guest on the podcast was Sue, who you heard in one of the clips earlier. She was the one that lived on the houseboat. The episode was about her divorce, and she spoke very honestly about her pain, but then she also said this.
I look at the grief I've had in my life, and it walks beside my shoulder. It is my life companion. And I want it to be, because I want it to remind me of who I am and the life that I lead.
We're learning that there's a very good place in this world for grief. It's brought us all some of the best support networks there are in the world. Grief has brought our podcast guests new lives. It's brought appreciation for life, gratitude, deep forgiveness, new relationships, freedom, and so much more.
Much as it might feel like it at times, it's not all bad.
Okay, a few things that we'd like you to remember, and we'll talk through these again. You know, the first thing to remember, it's okay to start to heal. That doesn't diminish what you lost or mean you're forgetting the pain.
You need to forget about others to a degree, not in a bad way, but don't worry about what other people are thinking of your grief journey. If it's stopping you feeling the feelings inside, then it's rarely helpful to dwell on that. Quite often the most common thing we hear is people commentating on maybe the fact that you should be beyond it now, or you should be at a different stage because it's been however many years. Not dwelling on that is actually really helpful. Unless they're coming to you in love about something that you might need to change, on the whole, dwelling on what other people are thinking of your journey is not something to dwell on.
Teresa's put in the chat that she lost her brother, her only sibling, about 11 years ago, and found that she went through a lot of these stages of grief. There's used a lot of these sort of elements to consider to help her cope. So thank you, Teresa, for sharing that. Another thing to remember, that we live in the living world. It's important that when the time is right, we do re-engage with that. The temptation is there to stay focused on our loss, and it will be strong. It might even feel more comfortable to stay in that place, but it's not going to help long term.
It's really important to know that to move forward, you don't have to leave your loss behind. Though some people might prefer to do that. We have known people that have put a deadline on their grief. I'm going to give myself 3 years for this, and then I'm going to, try and move on. Obviously, it goes with them to a degree. But however you deal with it, the loss will always be part of you in some way. But choose to make it a good part of you and not a bad part.
You will be different afterwards. You'll be a different person, and that's okay. Sometimes what you've experienced may involve a form of loss of self. You might need to grieve that, but we've rarely spoken to someone that considers themselves a worse person after grief.
And another message, like Emily was saying before us, you are not alone. Bianca, who I mentioned before, also said on the podcast, grieving in isolation is never a good idea. Find your people to share your grief with. Loss is way too big for you to do on your own. So, hope. How to find it. What about hope? How do we find it? Can we find it? At times it probably feels like we can't. We've asked every single one of our guests what role hope has played, if any, in their grief. And we've had a variety of answers. Some people have said it was the only thing that got them through, a lifeline that they never let go of. Some people have said it came and went. Some people have said they've had moments when they were completely hopeless, no hope at all. But not one of them has said they don't have it now after their loss. And we've spoken to people months after their loss, right through to decades after their loss. Not one of them lost it completely after or because of their grief. Of course, it does depend on how people see hope, and there will be some people out there who are in that boat. But it depends on how you see it. Some people see it as a deep element that's rooted at their very core. It's just naturally always there. Some see it as something that they wish for themselves or for others. They hope this will happen, they hope that will happen. Some see it as just believing in the future, that there are good things ahead. Some people have it written on items in their house, and it reminds them this isn't the end, there is always hope. And for some, it's a faith in an eternal being or a God that they fully rely on. We believe it's vital for getting through grief, and our experience so far is telling us that it is definitely possible to find it in every kind of loss. In the Bible, there's a proverb that says, "Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a longing fulfilled is a tree of life." We've spoken to people about when their hearts are sick, and so often that's at the same time that they lost hope. But as the proverb said, we've also found that their hope was actually deferred, not completely lost, even if they couldn't see that at that exact moment. A quote we often use on the podcast is from Desmond Tutu, who said this: "Hope is being able to see there is light despite all of the darkness." I think this quote really shows you that what's at the root of hope, and it's a belief that there is light despite the darkness.
Yeah, hope doesn't mean that there's nothing bad going on, that it's not dark, that it's not painful, or life isn't getting you down. It is a choice to believe there is hope despite all the grief. To see light, you have to open your eyes and look for it despite the dark. And hope, here's the tricky bit, is a choice. It's a choice to look for it, to choose to believe it's there, to seek it. And our experience over the last 4 years is showing us that it doesn't just come to some people and not to others.
And we know it's not easy. It's not what you want to be doing in grief, finding things to choose and go after and believe in. You want something to come to you, all nicely wrapped and easy to believe, that helps you straight away. But hope isn't like that. But it is always there for those that want it.
A psychologist called George Weinberg said this: "Hope never abandons you, you abandon it." And we believe, and we've seen through the podcast, that hope is always there, always available if you want it, but it is a choice. And be prepared to find it in a way that's unique to you.
We know it's not easy to keep hope alive, and some people choose not to, but we fully believe that it's vital that you try. It won't always be a roaring flame, but it could be a faithful little small pilot light, as one of our guests put it. And you might find that the more loss you go through, the stronger your hope actually becomes, and it can be a real anchor in life's storms once you've found it and found a way to keep it. Or maybe you're preparing yourself for loss, and so your hope is something that you're already working on. I really believe that will make hope easier to find and cling to if you're in the trenches of grief.
Just to pause and send a message to Camille for the final bit of audio coming up. Thank you so much for your help with playing it through your screens in just a moment's time. Thanks to David as well, who's just recognising in the chat that it is about moving forward with your loss rather than getting over your loss, becoming more familiar and comfortable with it rather than shutting it down or suppressing it. Thanks, David, for that. And Kathy, yeah, so true. So earlier we shared with you some things our guests have said in the last bit of audio about the worst moments of their grief. But what do they have to say about the good things that came through grief? Like the hope and the things they've learnt from it. We'll hopefully hear from some of them now in this final bit of audio. It's just a couple of minutes long. You might recognize some of the voices from previous clips.
All right, perfect. I've got that pulled up, so I'm just going to go ahead and share it now.
Thank you.
There are no rules with this. Grief doesn't have rules.
Don't expect the grief journey to be linear. It's all over the place. It's a child's scribble of backwards and forwards, up and down.
Sometimes grief and loss can crystallize some beauty in your life and some positive action.
Don't feel bold enough to say that I would change the ending, because the ending has had some really beautiful growth and miracles after it.
You only grieve if you loved. That makes you more of a human being, not less.
When I say every bad thing has the seed of something good inside it, I believe that so much now.
I finally stopped trying to create my story the way I wanted it to be and let it find its specific place in this world. And that's when the joy started bubbling out.
I have a lot of hope in my life, and my life isn't all about grief and child loss.
Hope's everything, isn't it? Hope is the ability to dream.
Recovery could have been smoother if I just allowed myself to feel every single feeling that I was feeling and knowing that it is normal.
You can live a full and joyful life carrying joy and sorrow in the same hand.
That's one reason I really wanted to share our story for people that are struggling out there, to give them hope, to let them know there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
I feel like your show, it's one of the few podcasts in the world that has really touched my heart, because You guys are looking at what people don't want to look at and saying, look, there's still hope.
The best things that have come out of my life have been as a result of loss.
No matter how bad you think it is, even if it's just the hope that tomorrow will be better, hold on to that and you will get there.
I realized that when one is like really enveloped in grief, that you have to remember that that light is still up there, that light of hope. It's not very far away. It's still there. It hasn't gone away. It is still a wonderful life, despite the difficulties that you go through.
There were so many clips we could have chosen from for that bit. In fact, far more than the sad ones, really. And once you've found something good in grief, something that gives you hope, we believe it's important to share that with others to help them through their grief. And so we give our guests the opportunity to do that by asking them all the same last question. What's your Herman? Yes, it makes no sense on first hearing. We made it up. In fact, there's a podcast episode and a blog that explains it in full on that link. But in brief...
We've heard of the Herman cake, right? It's based on an Amish bread starter, the sort of thing that you feed, you care for, it grows, you then multiply it, pass it on to somebody else who feeds it, looks after it, an edible thing you can make cake or something else from, like bread. In Europe, it went round with the name Herman cake. Effectively, it could live forever. And we liken this in our podcast to what we, as individuals, nurture, feed, nourish, what grows, which can then be multiplied and shared on with others. So every loss episode ends with us asking our guest what their Herman is. What do they want to hand down? What have they grown, nurtured, nourished that they can share, that they've learned in their grief and give to somebody else that's going through something similar? It could be a word of advice. It could be a strong sense of something, a reflection. Maybe something physical like a book or a poem, maybe something they've learnt to do, a lesson, and so on. These are things to give others hope, to show there is life after loss.
And in 2024, I turned Herman's into an actual grief companion. There's always one somewhere in the house. These are little crocheted creatures that I hand make for people to send someone that's grieving, to help them know they're not alone. And there are Hermans all over the world now, including a few in the US, as well as Australia, Ireland, UK, and they help people through the day-to-day of carrying grief. Because life goes on, but you still carry your loss, and sometimes you just need a little squishy blue creature with you that knows that.
We want to finish with a final question for you to consider. What's your Herman?
If you stop to think about all you've been through in life, all the losses, the gains, the sacrifices, the blessings, the successes, the disappointments, through all of it, if you could pass something on to help someone else with their grief.
What is your Herman?
Maybe just give it some thought for a second. And that's what we ask all our guests. It's so important to us that if we've got through grief, through it, but we've got through the initial stages and we've found something good in it, that we share it with other people to give them hope, because every day somebody is starting that grief journey all over again, feeling just as lost and isolated. And if they can see people on the other side of it, we like to think that gives them hope to get there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you for staying with us. We'll hand back to our hosts. We're really happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, we just hope today that we've sparked something in you that will help you through your loss, or maybe encourage you to know this isn't the end and you're not alone. But also we'd like to think we'd sparked some new hope in you too.
The Q&A is available. If you've got anything you'd like to ask now or in the days ahead, you can find us through the silentwhy.com website. Thank you.
Oh, we've got a question already. Okay, let's stop sharing our screen. You can look at our faces. So Brian asked, how do we find guests to interview on the podcast? A mixture of ways. Some of them have found us. Some of the most interesting ones have found us, actually. They've come up to us and approached us and sort of said, I've got this loss that I don't think you've covered. Would you want to talk about it? And usually I'm like, yes, because it's really hard to find people that are happy to go through the full experience with us. They're deep conversations. It's about the rawness of grief. Not everybody wants to go there on a podcast. We totally understand that. So sometimes they find us. Sometimes if we've got a specific loss we're after, and we have got a rough list that we've put together that we'd like to cover, I will look around and find people who are already talking about it somewhere. I don't tend to approach people who've never spoken about it openly unless we already know them personally. Sometimes I'll approach them. quite often don't get a reply. Sometimes I do. And then I think it's just research quite often, trying to find people. Mostly, most people have found us. So it's been an interesting journey finding the guests.
I think we started before we launched the podcast by writing a list of all the losses that we could think of, from obvious things like, the loss of hair. Don't know why I go to that one. I'm not balding just yet. Loss, bereavements, loss of family members, friends, and so on and so forth. And we had a list of about
80, I think.
80 before we even started.
So we
haven't even got close to those as yet. So thanks for the question, Brian.
Wondering what has been helpful support that you've received while grieving versus responses that were well-intentioned but not helpful. This could be comments, presence, actions from others. Yeah, anyone can answer that on the chat. It'd be really interesting to hear other people's answers to that as well. For us, I think helpful support has been people who have really tried to learn our journey or learn about the type of grief. And I think people like that are quite rare. So when you find them, it's a huge blessing. And the best support for me have been just having women around me, because, a lot of women around me are mothers, and having people around me that know the situation I'm in and that can be hard sometimes has been massive. And I see them sometimes making an effort. If everyone's talking about their children and what's happening, there'll be one there that will turn to me and say, how's the podcast going? Or they'll ask me about something completely different. And I really appreciate that, because it makes you feel seen and less alone. And I think it's nice for then us to be those kinds of people, to recognize if we're in a room and everyone's talking about their mum, maybe there's someone there who lost their mum.
Across many episodes with many different individuals, well-intentioned comments that have missed the mark a bit. It's quite a common thread, isn't it? And there's quite a common response generally, because it's like, don't say nothing, just say something. There's more appreciation for individuals, for friends, for family, for saying something. That almost the worst thing in any supportive environment is just to go quiet, to go silent, to distance yourself from whoever it is that's grieving. Say something. Ask, how are they? How are you feeling? What is that like? Be mindful of, just treading carefully, but, don't leave them to it. I think that's been really important for all those that have just been on the wrong end of comments that have hurt, that have cut deep.
And sometimes people will say no. You'll ask them about the grief and they just shut you down. And that's fine. That's okay. That's not anything on you. Some people aren't ready to talk about it. But I think some people trying to talk about it is better than not. The hardest thing, I think, with children, as I guess a lot of people will have experienced on this session, will be just questions from strangers, mindless questions. Are you married? Do you have children? Just straight up front. When I got to a certain age, I found people would, instead of saying, do I have children, they would ask me what age my children were and would just assume I had them. That's just, I don't get upset by that. I know people don't know any better, but at the same time, I then have to tell them I don't have children, which then makes them get embarrassed. And then I feel like I have to look after them because they feel bad. It just creates this nightmare of a situation. So having questions you can ask people that don't involve those specific things, I think can be really helpful, just having those up your sleeve. And I've had a lot of listeners get in touch and say that's been one of the things they've taken away from it. They don't assume stuff when they meet new people. And I think that's really helpful for all of us.
We found as well more and more just a very simple little thing to remember with all the anniversaries, with all the greetings around, whether it's birthdays, Thanksgivings, Christmases. When somebody just offers you the greeting, happy Thanksgiving, happy birthday, sometimes you could just turn that around and just say, was it a happy Christmas? Was it a happy New Year? You get some really interesting conversations by not just leaving that little comment as a happy greeting and then moving on, but actually saying, was it a happy New Year? We found that to be a really lovely tool as well.
Yeah. And Camille's asked, what have you learned through the experience of hosting this podcast so far, walking alongside others with grief? I think for me, it's just been that you're not alone, but also we set it up because we recognized childlessness was a grief. I had not grieved it properly until I started listening to how other people had grieved things. I started to allow myself to grieve it a bit more, which felt weird because it was about 10 years after all of our infertility stuff. So then I was questioning, is this too late to grieve something? And I learned that it's not. Your grief journey looks like what it looks like. So that's been the biggest thing for me, is helping me know I'm not alone in how I'm feeling. Loads of other people are going through it. I think that's huge to help us. We're not alone. There's lots of people feeling the same way. And just sort of, just sort of allowing yourself to know that that's a good thing, and that you can help each other within that. And that's what we wanted the podcast to do. If you can't have big conversations, or you don't know that people are really suffering, then you can listen into other people having those conversations and know that you're not alone and just learn from them. I've learned so much about how to deal with grief just from how other people have dealt with grief, and they're usually a loss that's completely different to mine. It doesn't even need to be the same loss.
And I think men that are on the call, Brian, David, a little bit of vulnerability from a guy goes a long way. A lot of our guests have just been so open and vulnerable and just enjoyed the conversation afterwards. It's like, oh, that felt so good. And we get comments back from friends, family, from people that have listened saying, gosh, you're brave talking about this. It's like, no, we want to model that sort of conversation for others to follow suit, to be interested, to care. And just, a little bit of vulnerability with somebody else. When somebody asks you a question, don't just say, yeah, fine, good, move on, share something of what you're feeling. Allow them the opportunity, even if it's a bit awkward, just to take an interest, to ask you a question. Maybe just give them that sort of kind space where they can inquire without knowing that you're going to shut down or back away. If you're in that sort of place, a little vulnerability can go a long way. I think we're just about done. We're on the hour mark.
We are. Look at the timing.
So we'll hand back to Camille. Thank you so much for having us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for joining us, guys. You've given us a lot of great information and posed a lot of really interesting questions. So thank you so much for coming on.